Okay, this is actually attempt number 2 at this because the first attempt had a not screaming, child looking for some water at 11:30 at night. So, anyways, I am going to give you a synopsis of the Sachs article, Seeing Voices, A Journey into the World of the Deaf. What I'm going to do is sort of give you a rundown of what's in the article, and then sort of try and tie it to some of the stuff we've been learning over the past few weeks. And see where we go from there. So there may be a written follow-up after this. We'll see what happens. We'll see how this goes. So basically, this is a really good article. I really quite enjoyed it. Sachs outlines this really almost tragic tale of the history of deaf people and deaf speakers, well, deaf people are across Europe and North America over the past 300 or 400 years. He sort of begins by breaking down deafness into prelingual deaf people and postlingual deaf people. So people who were born deaf and who've never heard speech, and people who grew up hearing speech and have gone deaf over time. One of the contributors, David Wright, describes actually uh, going deaf, and once he was deaf, describing uh, um, having phantom voices, sort of much in the way of somebody who loses an arm or a leg describes having phantom pain from the missing limb. Wright described having phantom voices. Even after he'd gone deaf, he would still hear things. And I believe it was Wright who also described not realizing he was deaf. He was taking in all of the nonverbal cues of facial expression and body language and all the things that goes into communication that hearing people sort of take for granted. Um, and it wasn't until he was conversing with his cousin or something like that that his cousin turned away and he realized that he could no longer hear his cousin. That in fact he was actually deaf, and it was kind of at that moment that he realized that things were different for him. So, anyways, Sachs and Stoddard go through this sort of history of the deaf and how deaf language has been both at times celebrated uh, and fostered through the creation of sign, and then also repressed. Ironically, not Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Graham Bell, who taught Anne Frank, was one of the great oralists. He was one of the people who essentially decided that deaf people should learn to speak with a voice rather than give full range to their communication abilities through sign. Um, the article really sets up sign as being um, not only a communications tool but a language almost in and of itself. Um, and that's not to say that a deaf signer from China will understand a deaf signer from England who will understand a deaf signer from France. That's not it at all. It's that by having access to a language, um, um, people can sort of go from being what they call functionally illiterate, not having a language. You could be a perfectly intelligent person, but if you don't have a language, people will assume that you are have some sort of mental deficiency. So we really start looking at the importance of language, and the importance of being able to give yourself voice and the richness and fullness that gives to a life. Um, there's also some really interesting ties in this article to perhaps sign being some of the first languages. There's certainly some really good historical content in here, sort of modern history from the 18th and 19th century, whereby um, deaf people who are in schools where they're supposed to speak, coming up with their own rudimentary sign language that was far more um, uh, beneficial to them in terms of their ability to converse with each other, or to communicate with each other, than was anything that they were being forced to learn to speak, because they were being learned to speak while trying to learn content, and it wasn't working. It's really all about tapping into the communications tool that works best for the person. In the case of deaf people, that seems to be sign. And then looking back into sort of prehistory, there's some fairly good evidence that apparently sign could be some of the progenitors of early language. Perhaps we all started with sign and then developed uh, spoken and uh, spoken languages uh, down the line ways. Anyways, I guess um, that's sort of the nuts and bolts of the article. I guess sort of what I got really interested in was um, sort of looking back at some of the theories that we picked up in week 4, where we were talking about language being language and communication sort of being this coordination of behavior that brings forth realities. Um, and by denying deaf people the ability to communicate with everybody through sign, what you're really doing is you're really suppressing that bringing forth of reality, or that expression of reality, um, and really suppressing that manifestation of cognition that's supposed to be in everything, just by taking away that ability to communicate. So um, I found some really interesting ties there. And then I guess the other thing would be is looking ahead at these systems modeling units, and hard systems and soft systems, and methodologies and things like that. Um, the soft systems methodologies seem to be about um, recognizing these unique realities, and being able to for people to give rise to or to give voice to those realities, um, through whatever communication means that is. Say the rich picture tool. The rich picture tool to me is almost um, sort of a universal communications tool that somebody who's deaf and somebody who's verbal, or somebody who's signs and somebody who's verbal can share. They can both, through whatever medium they're using, um, interact with the rich picture model, and then you get a much more honest view of these varying viewpoints. Um, that's kind of what I have for now. I'll chalk it up to being late at night and other things to do, or other things to do, well, do like sleep. I'm going to give the article another read, and I may pull this video down and replace it with something else. But for now, um, that's kind of where I am with it. I'd love to have your comments. Type them up. Either leave them on this YouTube comment site, or put them back on the Moodle site. Maybe just stick them on Moodle, um, and let me know what you think. I really like the idea of language. I think you probably noticed that through that week, the Santiago Theory of Cognition week. I spent a lot of time talking about the coordination of language and behavior, and I kept going back to it. I find it fascinating, and that's really why I wanted to read the article on the deaf. Is I really um, I really find the idea that you can suppress someone's outlook, or suppress someone's reality in a sense, by taking away their language, or not giving them a language to begin with. Um, to be, perfectly honest, it's fascinating, but it's also kind of evil when you think about it. Um, I mean, you would essentially be denying an entire segment of the population uh, their reality, and forcing them to accept your reality. Um, and perhaps that's where some of that apparent, what's being termed retardation, comes into play. Is not only that people can't express their reality, but by having to assimilate, say, a reality that's thrust upon them through another communication medium, um, you're asking them to coordinate a behavior that's not their own. And I think that would sort of set up some weird internal things for people as well. So, anyways, I hope this was helpful. It kind of feels rambly. I was trying to do it without really having a text document in front of me. It's, obviously fairly free associative, but let me know what you think. Thanks. See ya.